Hello everyone. We hear a lot about impending US dollar crash. Like this CNBC report.
Analysts have been warning of the dollar's impending doom.
I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I think I will use the word doomed in the long term.
But do we know what to expect if this actually occurs? How this can affect us personally, what kind of opportunities and risks involved? Let's talk. We can't know the future, but we can explore some recent currency crashes and project them onto our own situation. We will take a look at Venezuela. Currency crisis in this country is truly unique and has many lessons to learn from. I believe it's a longest-running economic phenomenon that's been ongoing since 1980 until present and has no analogues in the modern history. Usually, currency crisis is an event. In Venezuela, it's a continuous chain of crisis events, stretching for over 40 years. It included long stretches of unabated double-digit inflation for decades, with peaks as high as 130,000% in 2018, devaluations by decrees, various formal and informal pegs, government-backed petrocurrency, non-orthodox income sources like farming, virtual gold, and cyber games. We will not have time for all of that, but Venezuelan story is a one-of-a-kind and is worth check out. This is a current price of 1 ounce of gold in bolivars. I don't know what this number is called. Picture speaks for itself. If you know the name of this number, please post it in the comments for all of to know. I will be really impressed. Let's define what do we mean when we say currency crash or a currency crisis. Investopedia defines currency crisis as sudden and drastic devaluation in a nation's currency matched by volatile markets and a lack of faith in the nation's economy. A currency crisis is sometimes predictable and is often sudden. It may be precipitated by governments, investors, central banks, or any combination of actors. But the result is always the same: the negative outlook causes wide-scale economic damage and a loss of capital. If we are talking about an outright and sudden currency collapse, as it is defined by Investopedia, you do not want to be a part of that. There are no winners in such an event, maybe very few individuals at the centers of decision-making. If you think today's transfer of wealth is unfair, in currency implosion, you might expect wealth of an entire nation to be siphoned to a literally few recipients. If currency collapses, entire economy along with all social and political infrastructure can seize. If there is no trusted currency, businesses go bust, trade stops, unemployment skyrockets, social benefits like healthcare, unemployment and pensions freeze. Police, power structures and military collapse. Crime rates explode, local warlords flourish. If you think this is a fantasy, unfortunately we have seen all of this before and not too long ago, thankfully, not in this country. Experiencing a complete collapse of sovereign currency would basically mean going back to the basic necessities: food, shelter and security. It can get really ugly. US is in a unique situation. During Mexican peso crisis of 1994, also known as tequila shock or tequila crisis, problem was solved with IMF injection of $50 billion with assistance from then President of United States Bill Clinton. Looking at the most recent history, we can say that with very few exceptions, most of the currency bailouts were done with the US dollar. Usually, assistance is dispensed by IMF and World Bank. In the recent years, in EU, assistance to the individual members is given by ECB and European Union organizations. Matter of fact, ECB is gearing up for some currency turbulence in very near future. You probably have seen some breaking news that Italian parliament was just dissolved. This dissolution happened right after attempt by their prime minister to resign. I do not know what happened behind closed doors, but I can suspect that Italy is in a panic mode due to approaching winter and its dependence on Russian gas, high debt, low productivity and high interest rates. ECB just recently came out with a policy to cap the difference between bond yield within the Union. Which means yield control. This is telling us about big problems with financial system within EU. Yield control is a sure precursor to a currency devaluation. Look at Japan. It's a story for another time. Now, if we run into the sovereign US dollar collapse, what can be used to bail out US? Pesos? Euro? Rubles? Yen? Given the size of the dollar juggernaut and problems within EU, I don't think so. Consequences of a complete collapse of the US dollar will be hard to imagine. I think there is very clear understanding among international community of the risks of dollar collapse. India, China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela and many others are working overtime to find an alternative to US dollar, given the way US economy is managed. I'm sure no one wants to hold this hot potato when this bubble burst. China just reported lowest holdings of US treasuries in decade. Even some close allies of US, like Israel, are slowly shedding dollars from its central bank reserves and diversifying into other currencies like Canadian dollar, and, among others, Chinese yuan. When you start seeing Israel moving assets into Chinese currency from US dollar, everyone holding dollars should be worried. I do not see an imminent collapse of the US dollar just yet. Currency collapse is basically a crisis of confidence. We can use analogy of run on a bank. News spread that a bank is in trouble, and in the morning, you find a line of bank creditors banging on the bank door. No bank can survive simultaneous withdrawal of all assets by creditors, and even healthiest bank would simply run out of cash before it can collect on all the loans extended. Currency collapse is something very similar. As soon as foreigners start getting bad news, short sellers swoop in and panic starts. Assets denominated in a local currency dumped at any price, while local currency is converted into whatever foreign currency available. Usually, government is faced with a choice to support currency with reserves or halt the withdrawals and ask for the debt restructuring. Creditors get wiped out, country gets a fresh start. The reason I do not see overnight implosion of the dollar is that the large portion of US debt is owned by a few big players who would not want to see their assets go to zero. China, Japan and Norway each own more than $1 trillion in dollar-denominated assets. Plus, US Federal Reserve. And I'm sure Russia will not be in a hurry to dump the dollars, US will make sure of that. Russian part is just my joke. But China, Japan, Norway, Switzerland and so forth will not act rashly. Any decision will be discussed and planned well in advance. But let's take a look at real-life cases. Venezuela. Sovereign currency crisis in this country is well documented and widely discussed in media. Let's take a look at what happened and let's consider the consequences and implications. We will try to project Venezuelan experience on US situation and make some predictions. It all started with collapse in oil prices in 1980s. It was the time of big challenges worldwide. Collapse of USSR, new economic direction in China, economic troubles in US. Double-digit inflation and negative economic growth in Venezuela continued throughout decade, and, by 1989, inflation was running at 84% annual rate. This prompted administration at the time to cut government spending, and in the same year, capital of Venezuela, Caracas, experienced widespread looting and rioting. I think this theme of public disturbance is almost guaranteed during any currency collapses. It was true throughout entire history of the civilization, regardless of cultural or socio-economic organization of the society. If the standards of living plummet, people rise up. It was true in Greece in 2016 during anti-austerity protests. It was true in Italy in 2014. It was true during Arab Spring. The level of violence will vary, but social unrest is almost a guaranteed outcome of any major economic turbulence. Currency crisis is usually a consequence of bad economic situation. Is it possible to imagine social disturbance in US if dollar collapses? Almost a guarantee. That's why you do not see much appetite among any politicians to implement any type of financial austerity measures. So why Venezuela ran into this economic predicament? While it's a combination of many factors, dependence on oil prices seems to be a culprit. Whole economy was, what you can call it, an oil-based economy. How does this relate to US? US is a consumer-based economy. I still struggle to understand how the whole economy can be based on consumption and not on production. The emphasis sounds all wrong. It's like a personal finance strategy based on credit card model. You just borrow and consume. Not sure it sounds like a sustainable economic model, but it worked for a while. Never mind record debts in all areas. So imagine for a moment, if oil prices pushed Venezuelan oil-based economy into 40-year economic turmoil, what happens if in consumption-based US economy, consumption, which really underpins entire economy, slows down? Can we imagine US finding itself in a Venezuelan predicament? Especially in light of Federal Reserve trying to stifle consumption. I think there is a non-zero chance. Especially if you explore the post-bubble economy of Japan since 1990s. Bank of Japan was trying to stimulate consumption for decades without much success. Well, they just have succeeded, we will watch what happens. Now, US can handle high debt due to its reserve currency status. But as we see more and more countries moving away from US dollar towards widespread use of bilateral sovereign currency trade agreements, this privilege will ultimately expire. So eventual collapse of US dollar is becoming more and more of a non-zero probability. Moving on into Venezuelan crisis history. I actually wonder. If you lived through 40 years of continuous economic hardship, would you consider another chapter in economic trouble a crisis? Wouldn't you just get accustomed to it, adopt and just see it business as usual? I think I have an idea. Venezuelan history again suggests the answer. Wikipedia describes reaction of the population to continuous economic hardship in a following quote: refugee and migration crisis. Emigration in Venezuela has always existed in a moderate way. But since 2015, 30% of the population has left the country due to the hyperinflation. I think these numbers answer the question with utmost clarity. Will it be possible to see mass emigration from US, should US fall into a currency crisis? Maybe, maybe not. I will definitely expect a mass exodus of migrants out of US. And it will be in millions. You have seen effects of US economic slowdown during 2020 events on immigration. It was lowest in decades. Slowdown in economic activity will equate to a lesser incentive for foreigners to come, which might in turn limit US access to cheap labor, adding to inflationary pressures. Moving on. By the mid-1990s under President Rafael Caldera, Venezuela saw annual inflation rates of 50 to 60% from 1993 to 1997, with an exceptional peak of 100% in 1996. The percentage of people living in poverty rose from 36% in 1984 to 66% in 1995. Here we see another hallmark of currency crisis. Substantial decrease in living standard. As we see with the example of Venezuela, majority of population will be thrown below poverty levels. This is not an accident. As business struggle to stay open, unemployment skyrockets and social subsidies overload government budgets. Social costs of a currency collapse will be catastrophic. It takes years to rebuild economy. Some economies seem to never recover. In case of Venezuela, US actually played a big role in prolonging internal conflict. By seizing its gold reserves, supporting opposition and imposing economic sanctions, US in fact, stopped the flow of capital needed to rebuild. Well, another brick in the wall. US will only have itself to blame for the loss of reserve currency status. Back to Venezuela, in the next decade, inflation remained in the double-digit territory. By 2010, inflation had removed any advancement of wage increases. By 2014, it was the highest in the world at 69%. By 2016, the media reported that Venezuela was suffering an economic collapse. The IMF estimated a 500% inflation rate and a 10% contraction in GDP. In November 2016, Venezuela entered a period of hyperinflation. In May 2019, the Venezuela released economic data for the first time since 2015. It reported that the inflation rate was 274% in 2016, 863% in 2017, and 130,060% in 2018. The new report suggested a contraction of the economy by more than half in 5 years. In October 2019, the unemployment rate reached 35%. By the end of the year, it was estimated that it would increase to 39 to 40%. Unemployment is a major byproduct and a problem arising from currency collapse. It precipitates lower standards of living, putting a major roadblock on any efforts to facilitate a recovery. Now to the final stage. After all these years of struggling to bring stability to national currency, Wikipedia states, following increased international sanctions throughout 2019, the Maduro government abandoned policies established by Chavez such as price and currency controls, imposed since 2003, which resulted in the country seeing a rebound from economic decline. According to a survey by economic consultant Econolytica, about 54% of transactions in Venezuela during September 2019 were in US dollars. The number of transactions in dollars raised up to 86% in some places. The survey also found that almost all sales of electrical appliances are dollarized, as well as half of the sales of clothes, spare car parts and food. In a November 2019, President Nicolás Maduro described dollarization as an escape valve that helps the recovery of the country, the spread of productive forces in the country and the economy. Some Venezuelan banks began to issue debit cards in US dollars on January 29, 2021. Last part is a bit surprising. Given the long-standing US policy of regime change in Venezuela, using dollar-denominated instruments in banking seems very counterintuitive, but time will tell. With current push by US administration to shore up worldwide oil production at all costs, Maduro might be safe for a while. Until US decides otherwise. Now, let's speculate. Venezuela seems to find a temporary solution to its currency problem. An informal peg to the US dollar. History teaches that pegs do not last, and without changes to the underlying economy, the peg will eventually fail. It was true for the Bretton Woods peg of the dollar to gold. It might become true for national currencies within Eurozone. If US dollar started to fail, where can we turn to? One of the possibilities might be some form or gold-based monetary system. Latest news from Zimbabwe proves this point. They just announced issuance of gold coin and decreed to use it in circulation to help get rid of US dollar dependency and to prop up local economy. As I mentioned in the beginning, we can't see future. But we can take steps to protect against some possible outcomes. I am going to show the price of gold in Venezuelan currency again. What would have happened to our dollar savings if US went through a major inflationary event? It is hard to believe it can happen. But do you want to take this chance? Current strengths of the US dollar offer a great opportunity to diversify. I am not a financial advisor, but my plan is to have a good position in real assets like gold, silver, real estate, especially income-producing real estate and some crypto. What is yours? As always, thank you for watching. Subscribe and like if you would like to receive more content like this. Until next time.